Welcome to New York tomorrow. It is now the 1st of January 1911, and the task before us is to speculate what tomorrow might bring based on the events of our day. My name is John Smith, and joining us is Mr. William James Johnson.
It is my utmost pleasure to be here.
Well, let us get to business. Today, on the front page of the New York Times, we find good reason to be hopeful. Dr. William H. Guilfoyle, Registrar of Records, submitted to Health Commissioner Lederle yesterday his annual report for the 1910 year on the mortuary statistics of New York City. 1910 has shown the lowest death rate in the history of the city, not only among adults but also among infants, and the highest number of births and marriages. This record is taken to signify that the public sanitation of New York is now better than it ever was before. What are your thoughts, Mr. Johnson?
Good news indeed. We have made progress on several fronts in the struggle for sanitary improvements, but I fear that there is one problem which we have done very little to address, that of the city's sewage disposal.
Do tell me more.
Well, according to one Mr. Simon Baruch, it appears that when the schoolboy of the future shall be asked to describe Manhattan Island, he will answer, a body of land surrounded by sewage. Not to indulge in too much detail, but it is abnormal for a great city to dump 700 million gallons of sewage into its harbor. Worse still if, as in our case, the currents of our rivers do not flush the foul mass to the sea.
Are you suggesting, Mr. Johnson, that the sanitary problem could worsen?
Without question, it is my belief that New Yorkers must demand action. If we are yet behind European cities on this matter, having grown to their scale, at times I wonder if we even have time to remedy the condition.
Well, perhaps the problem of the surplus population will not be so pressing in a few generations. According to Mrs. Donald McLean, President General of the Daughters of American Revolution, we will have other concerns.
Please elaborate.
Well, according to her, as women earn their own living and come closer to getting the ballot, fewer will bear children, while those who accept motherhood at all will have far fewer. That will, of course, mean a decreasing population.
And about when would that come into effect?
It must be in the next couple of generations.
Fascinating. Well, I suppose we could do with more working hands and fewer people. The city would certainly be cleaner, though I would be concerned about our standing among the world's nations.
We have very little to be concerned about. After all, the Europeans are a sea apart from us, and no one else can challenge American industry.
I do hope for that, Mr. Smith.
Welcome to New York tomorrow. It is the 1st of January 1926, and the task before us is to imagine what tomorrow will bring based on the events of today. My name is John Smith, and joining us today is Mr. William James Johnson.
It is my pleasure to be here.
Well, let's begin on a hopeful point. 8 years have passed since the Great War ended, and Europe's great powers seem determined to avoid its repetition. Last year's Locarno Accords have settled Germany's western borders for good. According to the Times, though, there are nationalists in both France and Germany who dislike the spirit and works of Locarno. There is every indication that what was done here was approved by a very solid majority of both countries. What are your thoughts on this matter, Mr. Johnson?
I have no doubt that the European peace will be maintained. With robust American support, we have a stronger position of the League of Nations, and the utter barbarism and poverty that a repetition of the conflict would entail, I am confident that the continent has been pacified at last.
I do hope so, Mr. Johnson, though you must not neglect the importance of a sound industrial recovery.
Fortunately, that also appears to be well underway. If you pay careful attention to the articles that follow, you will find that Mussolini's Italy has managed to balance its budget, that the Dutch economy is quickly emerging as a bulwark of European commerce, and that even old Vienna sees reasons for hope, as long as tariffs remain relaxed. Indeed, when commerce flows freely, there is no need for large empires like that of the Habsburgs, save for the improvement of the colonial subjects, which, of course, the Hungarians, Czechs, and Romanians did not previously require.
That much is true.
Of course, Now, as for Germany and France, you will read that far from having unemployment, France is using 2 million foreign workers in its factories, and that Germany, far from the debt-stricken disaster that it was a few years ago, has got back to a gold basis and achieved a budget surplus of over 1/3, all due, in no small part, mind you, to American support through the Dawes Plan.
Well, let us hope that a strong Europe can rise to her feet and compete on a sound basis with American industry so that the world may prosper into the future. On a different note, did you read the article on street traffic accidents last year?
I did not. Do elaborate.
Well, it appears that during 1925 in Manhattan, these accidents have caused 3 times as many deaths as shooting and other crimes of violence, rising to about 82,000 cases from 1924.
I don't know what we will have to resort to with these automobiles.
Certainly, the city's population is only growing, as is the scale of its industries. And no matter how much one invests in sewage and sanitation, there is only so much space on our streets. As we grow more prosperous, ours is not a problem of squalor and war, and thank God for that. Yet, we cannot ignore that progress comes at a price.
Although, to be clear, a price well worth paying. If a few decades from now every man owns his own automobile, free from the noise and tumult of our streets, we will surely have made great progress in the direction of greater freedom. And of course, the Europeans will follow our lead, just as they have committed themselves to peace and concord half a century after we waged the Civil War among ourselves.
I do hope so, Mr. Johnson. Welcome to New York tomorrow. It is the 1st of January 1941, and the task before us is to imagine what the future will bring based on the events of today. My name is John Smith, and joining us is Mr. William James Johnson.
I'm glad to be here.
Now, unfortunately, squalor and war continue to be the order of the day around the world. Yesterday, Reichsfuhrer Hitler predicted an Axis victory over Britain this year and appeared to accuse President Roosevelt of exaggerating the extent of German aggression during his last fireside chat. Hitler claimed that he does not intend to conquer the world and that there is no Axis threat to the United States. He further claimed that ours is a country in which, though we have scarcely 10 persons per square kilometer to nourish and all the raw materials of the world at our disposal, we continue to have 10 to 12 million unemployed due to the lust for profit, corruption, and indolence of our ruling classes. A bold accusation, to be sure, coming from a man who feeds his people by looting hard-working Frenchmen, Dutchmen, and Poles.
You speak the truth, Mr. Smith. And that is exactly why Hitler will be defeated, according to novelist Booth Tarkington. While Britons are fighting for their life and liberty, the Nazis are fighting to retain other people's property. A man fighting for life, other things being equal, will put up a harder battle than a man fighting to keep something he took from somebody else.
I sure hope that Mr. Tarkington is right. The fall of Britain would surely be a deadly blow to the future of freedom everywhere. And the last thing we need in this depression is to go to war when our people can afford so little.
President Roosevelt has been doing everything possible to put America back on her feet.
And even so, any prospect of full recovery seems distant at best. Did you know that last year saw the lowest levels of stock trading since 1921? That was 20 years ago. These times sure do seem bright through memory's haze. Those happy, golden, bygone days.
Mr. Smith, I'm sure our listeners know that you went to Yale.
Forgive me, I was merely attempting to lighten the mood.
Ha! Well, now, as the economy is concerned, it only makes sense that the destruction in Europe and Asia has limited our capacity to grow. I do not find, as others do, that we are facing an inherent barrier to growth in a free enterprise system. That said, even as we wait for conditions to improve abroad, American ingenuity has made great strides in the realm of industrial organization. Harry W. Leidler, Executive Director of the League for Industrial Democracy, has emphasized the growing acceptance among large corporations of the principle of collective bargaining to improve the conditions of workers, the rise of consumers' cooperatives, and increase in minimum wages with shortened hours that have come about as a result. When peace and recovery do arrive, there will be a peace and a recovery for the working man, God willing, both here and in Europe.
Well, that would certainly be a future to look forward to. Welcome to New York tomorrow. It is now the 1st of January 1956, and the task before us is to imagine what the future will bring based on the events of today. My name is John Smith, and joining us today is Mr. William Johnson.
Glad to be here today.
Well, let's begin with a national news story. 77 days have passed, and despite arduous negotiations, the strike at Westinghouse Electric has not yet been lifted.
Disgraceful. If you ask me, the Taft-Hartley Act didn't go far enough. If we don't get our labor unions under control, how on earth will we be able to compete against the Soviet Union?
The future on that front does seem especially bleak. According to automation expert Albert C. Hall, Soviet engineering capabilities are set to soon surpass our own. He claims that they are as able as we are as far as technical ability is concerned, and that they are training a lot more engineers than we are. It may well be a feature of a free economic system that, by introducing frictions and disorder, it presents a grave obstacle to progress that centrally planned economies simply don't face.
It is certainly terrifying at times to consider how quickly the Soviet Union has progressed. 30 years ago, they were centuries behind us. Today, they are conducting nuclear tests armed to the teeth with technology as sophisticated as our own. Of course, there are some areas where they have yet to catch up. Modern New York skyscrapers with high-speed elevators and moving stairs remain unrivaled by anything Moscow has to offer. But one does wonder how soon we will fall behind.
Our allies are growing increasingly sympathetic towards Moscow, too. The elections in France tomorrow are set to give 34 new seats in Congress to the Communist Party, according to the semi-official forecast published by the Times. Despite their growing prosperity under a free enterprise system, many there seem to think that central planning may be the way of the future.
Well, it may be the way of the future, but certainly it is not the American way. I am certain that our nation will fight the communists tooth and nail. Even if the rest of the world turns red, we must remain a beacon of freedom in perpetuity.
I would certainly hope so. Now, do tell me, do we have any other news on the international front?
Something about the arrest of a Hanoi bishop by North Vietnamese communists. They're holding him and others like him in a concentration camp. A sad story, to be sure, but these distant backwaters never hold the strategic sway that our European and East Asian allies demand of us.
I tend to agree. Welcome to New York tomorrow. Today is January 1st, 1971, and we are about to imagine what the future will bring us based on the latest news. My name is John Smith, and joining us is Mr. Bill Johnson.
Happy to be here, Mr. Smith.
Well, let's get right to today's stories. Despite the Christmas ceasefire, U.S. combat deaths in Vietnam continue to escalate, rising to 41 this past week. Since January 1st, 1961, more than 44,000 Americans are listed as having died in action. According to the New York Times, Mr. Johnson, do you think that this is sustainable?
No, I do not. Frankly, this war is going to have to end at some point. And if we still haven't made enough of a dent in North Vietnamese morale to bring them towards a sincere ceasefire after all the resources and lives we've dedicated to this cause, I do not see how it could end other than American defeat.
To be clear, it would not be our first great defeat of the new decade. President Salvador Allende, the Marxist fellow elected in Chile last year, has, quote, brought another part of the country's economy under state control as the government purchased the controlling share of the nation's largest coal complex 24 hours after announcing a plan to nationalize the banks.
The fall of Cuba was bad enough. Now we have to contend with the possibility of elected communists in South America, with all of the risks to American trade and business interests that such governments would entail. Something has to be done. Otherwise, our freedoms at home may well be at risk.
Well, at the very least, we have some good news on the domestic front. President Nixon has set a 6-year deadline for automobile companies to develop an engine that is nearly free of pollution, pledging vigorous enforcement. Hopefully, this measure will result in cleaner cities. You can hardly breathe in New York anymore.
I certainly agree that some sensible government regulation is necessary. After all, we wouldn't have basic drainage and sanitation systems without it. It does seem, though, that all too often the government takes the side of trade unions at the expense of private actors. Our city's firefighters have decided to strike in the near future, despite the fact that, according to Commissioner Robert O'Leary, this would lead, inevitably, to a substantial increase in the incidence of fire and loss of life and property resulting therefrom. If you ask me, we ought to be able to fire and replace them. With so much government intrusion, our country is increasingly resembling the communist states that we are fighting against abroad.
That certainly strikes me as an exaggeration.
No. Mark my words, Mr. Smith. We are losing the Cold War abroad, and we are losing against the socialist creep at home. Only a drastic change of course can fix things, and I don't see any such change on the horizon.
Welcome to New York Tomorrow. Today is January 1st, 1986, and we are about to imagine what the future will look like based on the latest news. My name is John Smith, and joining us today is Bill Johnson.
Happy to be here, Jack.
Well, let's discuss what just happened in Afghanistan. After all of the resources and lives they've dedicated to a futile cause against the cause of freedom, the Soviet Russians are finally being forced to withdraw their military forces, consisting of 120,000 soldiers. Can you believe that? The socialist Afghan government has presented a timetable to that end. Bill, is there cause for hope on the horizon?
Of course. Between that and the rise of the reformist General Secretary Gorbachev to the highest Soviet office, it is increasingly clear that we are winning the Cold War abroad, in no small part by strengthening our economy at home.
I wouldn't be so sure about that last one. After all, the trade deficit for the first 11 months of 1985 surpassed that of all of 1984, which itself was a record high trade deficit. It used to be the case that Americans would almost universally buy automobiles built in Detroit. Very soon, you won't see anything other than Hondas and Toyotas on our highways.
I don't see why that would be a problem if we get better, cheaper cars from foreign economies like Japan's. As long as we can pay for them, the American consumer will be better off. It is also clear that our internal economy is growing strong enough to sustain ever larger deficits. Just last year, the nation's 14 major airlines hired a record 8,000 pilots in 1985 alone, one of the boldest expansions in the industry, and a clear product of President Reagan's measures to bring labor unions in line, cut taxes, and put purchasing power back in the hands of the American people.
Well, farmers' incomes have been declining since 1981, though. Is there not any kind of concern that the fruits of growth will be spread unevenly?
The farming sector is undergoing a temporary adjustment. Once the prices of labor, capital, goods, and services are all in line with the laws of supply and demand, the march towards prosperity will be unending. Even more so as places like Red China become increasingly amenable to free trade.
I certainly hope that you're right, Mr. Johnson. And it is true that the economic outlook is mostly optimistic at the moment. On a final note, I was wondering what you made of the latest State Department report linking the Libyan government to last week's terrorist attacks at the airports in Vienna and Rome. Is the growing link between rogue states and terror groups a threat to our freedoms?
Well, these links are definitely concerning, but the number of terrorist attacks in our country has been going down, not up, in the last few years, and in any case, these are often isolated incidents that don't put the average American any more at risk than they otherwise would be. I cannot imagine that on account of future terrorism, we will have to take any sort of extraordinary precautions at airports or other public spaces for that matter.
Order of the day around the world. Yesterday, what does that say? Despite arduous negotiations, the strike at Westinghouse House Electric has not yet been lifted.
Hartley Act didn't go far enough. If we don't get our if you ask me,
As able as we are as far as technically ability. This is such a weird sentence. What the our own? He claims that they are as able as we are to far as technical ability is concerned. First, 1971, and we were about to imagine what will the future. It's the 1st of January. You didn't change the date. It says 1971 on the blackboard. And lives they've dedicated to a